Hi, welcome to the channel Coder's Arc, where we unravel the world of coding and architecture together. And today I'm going to talk about how I was able to prepare and study for the AWS Professional Solutions Architect exam, and I was able to clear it in the very first attempt. Now, before I begin, I want to let you know that it took me about 10 months to prepare and study for this exam. And while that might seem like a lot of time, but in my case, I have a full-time job where I spend 70 to 80 hours every week, which I absolutely love. But due to that, the only time I could find to prepare and study for the exam was on the weeknights and weekends. But nonetheless, it was a very rewarding journey. And here are my top 5 tips. So, my first tip is recognizing your goals. In my case, I had 2 goals. My first goal was very basic, that I wanted to use it for professional advancement and career growth. But my second goal had more meaning behind it. Currently, I'm leading a team of solution architects that work on the enterprise architecture of an organization. So in our case, I wanted to make sure that I understand the best practices that are recommended by AWS in depth. So anytime I would find myself thinking that it's taking too long to prepare for this exam, I would remind myself of my goals. And in my case, I wanted to understand the content and the material really well. In your case, your goals could be different. For example, you might be preparing for an interview, or you might be trying to complete this exam very quickly, or you might be trying for a promotion. But whatever your goal is, remind yourself of that goal so that you always keep in sight. So, my second tip is the power of practice. In my case, I use the course content provided by Digital Cloud Training by Neil Davis. It's a series of about 19 chapters that are presented in the form of videos and PowerPoints. So when I went through this material, I took really comprehensive notes the first time around, and I can show you the notebook. This is a pretty thick notebook where I took my notes. But since I had the luxury of time and I wanted to understand the material really well, I took my time in taking these comprehensive notes. Now, I would say in the span of 10 months, I went through the entire material maybe 3 or 4 times from start to finish. And every single time I would go through the material, I would look at my notes and refine them as needed. So I would recommend you choose a strategy that works for you. Maybe instead of taking comprehensive notes, you are taking some screenshots and adding some notes to it. But whatever your chosen method of practice is, stick with it, and I cannot emphasize enough on the power of practice. So, my third tip is recognizing your strengths and weaknesses. In my case, I had been working with AWS for almost 4 years prior to taking this test. So some of my core strengths were application architecture, microservices, containers, EC2 instances, storage services, observability monitoring, and IAM roles. But some of my weaknesses were security architecture and networking. Once I was able to recognize my strengths and weaknesses, I was able to allocate time appropriately. Whenever I was preparing for my weaknesses, I made sure that I was in an undistracted environment and was able to focus as much as possible. But whenever I was preparing for areas that were my core strengths, I could listen to the material passively. For example, while I was in the gym on a treadmill, or while flying, or while driving a car, etc. But the goal here is you recognize your strengths and weaknesses and allocate your time appropriately. So those were some of my tips, but I would like to know how you, once you recognize your strengths and weaknesses, are able to allocate your time appropriately. So, my tip number 4 is taking the practice tests. In my case, I bought the tests from 2 different content providers, and I took the tests consistently. When I started, my scores were quite low. They were in the early 40s. But every time I would go through the content material from start to finish, the scores gradually went up. When I was done going through the material 3 or 4 times, my scores were still not great. They were still in the early 60s and 70s, but at least it gave me confidence that by going through the material thoroughly, my score is going to go up. Another strategy that I used while taking these tests was that I took them in 2 different formats. One was when I took the tests split by the subject category, and the other was when I took the tests where all the subjects were mixed in one test, like how it would be in the real scenario. But the key here is practice a lot, take the practice tests. They will help you manage time in the real test scenario. And finally, my tip number 5 for clearing the AWS Professional Solutions Architect exam is the final prep week, the peak week. In this week, you want to make sure you clear yourself from any and all distractions and are able to focus as much as possible. In my case, even though I have a full-time job, I took 2 days off from work so that I can immerse myself in the content material one more time as thoroughly as possible. And I also took a lot of practice tests during this time. Another thing to make sure during this time is that you're getting enough rest so that when you're taking the test, you feel focused and sharp. So, these are the top 5 tips that I used in preparing for the AWS Professional Solutions Architect exam. I would like to know from you, what are some of the strategies that you are using in preparing for this exam? And for those of you who have already cleared this exam, I would like to know how long did it take you and what were some of the strategies that you used for preparing for this exam. So, if you found the value in this content useful, please hit the subscribe and like button, and goodbye for now.